Let me start by introducing myself. I am Julian. I am the UK CEO of Edelman. I'm also the chair of Crisis and Risk globally. It's lovely to have you all here. My clicker, there we go. So I'm delighted to say that you won't just be hearing from me today. You will also be hearing from two extremely interesting speakers that we have lined up. After I've shared my findings from the report, Ed Williams, the President of International and former UK CEO, will be sharing some reflections from his time at Davos. And then I'm delighted to say we'll welcome Sir Nick Clegg, former UK Deputy Prime Minister and former President of Global Affairs at Meta, for a conversation with our Managing Director of Corporate Affairs, Selena, Callas. I should add, by the way, that for any of you who want to do a deep dive into the presentation, please use the QR code on the screen. This will also reappear magically at the end of this presentation. So look, now let's kick off with a look at the journey that we have been on that gets us to 2026. So, as I say, this is the 26th year of studying trust in four key institutions: government, media, NGOs, and business. And just a reminder that the Trust Barometer is fielded in 28 countries on 6 continents with an average of 1,200 respondents. Over this time, over this 26 years, the Trust Barometer has tracked everything from these relationships between the big institutions, and you can see how things have changed. In 2005, we shifted trust from authority figures to peers. In 2016, you saw a mass class divide, so different parts of society began to treat institutions differently. In 2018, social media took hold and disinformation began to proliferate as the battle for truth began in earnest. And in 2021, you can see during the COVID pandemic, trust in government declined and business stepped in as the most trusted institution. Now, on this next slide, we unpack the last few years in a bit more detail. This rather alarming slide shows you that over the last few years, these elements on the outside have been driving a changing attitude to the big institutions, so government, media, NGOs, and business. As we came out of the pandemic, these pressures created a sense of polarization. Now, as that polarization deepens, trust erodes, and institutions are increasingly viewed with suspicion. So perhaps you don't trust government to do what's right. Maybe you don't trust what you read in the media. For business, that institution which had been trusted for a long time, suddenly maybe it's not working for you. Maybe you feel like it's looking out only for the top brass. Now, when you no longer see these institutions working for you, you may begin to feel like you don't have to respect them. You don't have to sign up to their ways of doing things. And that is when you hit this age of grievance. That's where we were last year, where you felt entitled perhaps to take action into your own hands because you didn't believe the institutions were working for you. So that's when you saw people even feeling like violent action might be a justifiable form of behavior. If you were 16 to 24-year-olds, a third of you felt that that was an okay way to behave. By this year, we'd sort of reached that crescendo of grievance, and we moved into a situation where people had become exhausted. They were worn down by constant conflict, constant outrage, and rather than pushing back harder and getting more cross, many people were pulling away. And that's what you see in this last section, this retreat into insularity, a growing reluctance to trust anyone who feels different, who is unfamiliar, or outside our immediate circle. And this move from engagement to withdrawal is really the story of 2026, this story of insularity. Now, one of the consequences of that insularity is that it can impact the business community, and it's what we might call geo-economic nationalism. So people increasingly trust domestic companies over foreign ones. That domestic advantage is now 15 points on average, and people's wallets are following their beliefs. They prefer domestic products. And that creates headwinds for multinationals. So many of you in this room, particularly those who are headquartered in countries where there are a low global trust profile. And if you think about the events of the last few weeks with the US and how that is beginning to shape how people think about US companies and US brands, you can see this beginning to have an effect. And it reinforces the need for a new kind of internationalism for brands and companies, what we call a polynational approach, where global firms need to become deeply embedded in local contexts in order to protect their interests. Another stark slide here. When you ask people about the future, do you feel the next generation are going to be better off than the current one? Just 32% of those 28 countries say, yes, I do. If you look at the UK, 14%, just 14% believe the next generation are going to be better off. I almost want to pause here and say, I'm sorry this is such tough reading for a Thursday morning. Stick with it. It does get better, but not yet. When we look at the future of work, the picture is equally stark. We know that people have been worrying about recession and other economic challenges, such as trade tariffs, and that's up between 6 and 8 points, you can see here. When you factor in AI, the picture gets even more difficult. The majority of low-income respondents fear they are going to be left behind by AI. Those in a high income bracket are also affected. And in the UK, what you see is this is most stark across the low and middle income sectors. So what do people do when they're facing these worries? Well, they turn inwards. They turn away from the outside world. It's all too much. Just 39% of people are getting their information from sources with political leanings different from their own. That is down 6 points year on year. 20 of 28 markets report significant decreases. And as part of that turning away from information, one of the reasons people cite, 65% of people will tell you they believe that foreign actors are deliberately polluting the media landscape with false information to drive difficulties and polarization into our country. So people are turning away. They are less exposed to different voices. They can't escape the world around them. Ultimately, those difficulties like inflation or the pandemic, which affected their ability to trust institutions. I'm not saying the pandemic is still doing it now. I'm saying that was a point at which people started to step away. And as they turn away from these organizations on the left, they lean into the ones on the right. My family, my friends, my neighbors, my co-workers, my CEO become the big winners, and the people who people remain connected to. So they move from we to me. And that leads us to an insular mindset where 70% of people now say they are unwilling or hesitant to trust those who are different from them. What does that mean? It's people that live by a different set of values, people who believe different facts or have a different cultural background or lifestyle. Now, this worrying and important stat signals something deeper. This is a fraying of the social fabric. And it underpins not just society and cohesive communities, but it impacts business and economies as well. When people struggle to trust those who see the world differently, those risks are not abstract. They affect everything from political stability to workplace collaboration. And that insularity comes at a cost. I also want to re-emphasize this is not just a social issue, this is business. Think about your own workplaces. 42% are saying they would rather switch departments than work or report to a manager whose values are different from their own. 34% say that they'd put in less effort if their team leader had an opposing political view. And the same number, 34%, would support reducing the number of foreign companies in their country, even if that meant paying more. Now, this insularity is seen, obviously, as a problem by all of us who are witnessing it. It's not that we don't know it's going on. 76%, more than 3 in 4 people globally agree that this insularity has got to be addressed. But the interesting question that Ed raised when we were talking yesterday is, do we see it in ourselves, or do we think it's everybody else, not us? And that is something that we all, I think, have to take on board. Has it got into you as well? Can we see the challenge? I hope we can. what do we need to do to turn it around, to bring that light back to the end of the tunnel? Well, I'm pleased to say I think we have a framework that can help bring some solutions to this, and that's something we're calling trust brokering. So let's have a look at what it is and how you do it. Trust brokering is a set of practices and behaviors that seek to counter insularity by facilitating the rebuilding of trust across different audiences. Now, the how is really important. You don't try and change people's minds. Trust brokering surfaces the common interests of all parties. It's about listening and accepting that you may not agree with everything your neighbor or colleague says, but you have to try and find and understand where somebody is coming from as you seek to find the solutions to challenges that you face, whether that's society or business, the stuff that we are all here to think about. Now, who does this? Well, a trust broker can be a person, it can be an organization or an institution, but they have to be trusted by everybody in the room. And the business world is a great place to start. It's a place where people of different backgrounds still come together every day and are still trying to solve common problems. So look, in conclusion from me, I'm sorry to say, I hope next year I'll be sort of bringing you a really, really happy set of stats, but it is a tough old world out there at the moment. People are retreating into these insular groups as a way of escaping from or coping with the difficulties that they see out in the wider world. But we have to find ways to bring people back together if we're going to make it back to community, back to optimism for the future, and ultimately back to trust. Now with that, I'm going to hand over to Ed Williams to talk a little bit about how some of these things were landing in Davos last week.
Great, thanks very much, Julian. Yeah, round of applause. It's nice to see all of you and lots of familiar faces. I think some of you will know I've been doing this for 15 years now. So I've seen a lot of these reports. One of the most and interesting reports that we've done. Julian said at the beginning that there is a big slide deck on this. It's like 50 slides. We've only given you like the top kind of dozen today, but I would really encourage you to look at all of them. Not least because I think what we're kind of seeing now is people's perception of the world actually changing. There's an erosion of perception itself. You know, people can see the same events in totally different ways as we've all seen over the last few weeks. And as kind of we're all in the communication business, so understanding that that is going on, that there's a kind of rewiring of the brain, I think is really important. But Julian, to your point about Davos and what happened last week, because I think in many ways it kind of captures and is a demonstration of this insularity and the kind of bubbles that you were talking about this morning at the center of that diagram that looked like something from my geography class in the 1980s. But so look, my abiding impression of last week was the kind of sights and sounds of tectonic plates grinding against each other. In the kind of geopolitical realm, you've got one side almost enthusiastically directing a wrecking ball at the global system that we've all lived and operated in over the last 50 years. You've got the other side describing a rupture and making the case for maintaining some level of global cooperation, certainly through these middle countries. But in many respects, I think what was one of the most unsettling thing was the disconnect, actually, because amid this incredible geopolitical churn through this geopolitical storm, markets are still humming along as if none of this really mattered. Equity prices, credit swaps, capital flowing as though we weren't actually living through wars, decoupling, sanctions, massive rearmament in Europe, as if the grinding background noise was just that noise rather than actual structural breaks, which is, I think, what we are seeing. And for many, stability in prices could be mistaken for stability in the system itself. It shouldn't, I would argue. What I saw last week was boxes being opened all over the place. Anti-American sentiment in Europe was very evident. It was running strong in a way I'd never seen before. Military conflict with America was raised openly. Decoupling no longer just about China, but about Europe and the US. I mean, it all sounds kind of ridiculous until you hear it in the room said out loud, you know, in rooms that normally would police themselves. I was in a room with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, and a journalist asked him on stage, is Europe prepared for conflict with America? Now, a few years ago, a question like that would have been associated with bellowing laughter. Today, you know, I looked around the room and there were kind of nods and worried faces, despite the obvious absurdity of the question. You know, US and Europe have always been Mars and Venus, but the inability to understand each other and talk at cross purposes is wider than I've seen before, and there's less effort now to hide it. The feeling throughout the week was less a world with no rules. It was more a segmented world of emerging new American rules and existing Chinese rules, with Europe sort of caught between the two, either embracing American rules or devising some version of its own. And, you know, there was a palpable lack of confidence and certainty in Europe about what course of action to take against a backdrop of fiscal and military weakness. You all saw how Trump dominated the week. His extraordinary political ability to lead with the drama of a television show host remains potent. We saw the dramas, the bust-up, cliffhangers. What was he going to say on Greenland? Characters killed off. Huge crowds. Honestly, and I can testify to this, the biggest I have seen. Definitely at Davos there. I mean, the room outside where he was speaking was utterly packed for the spectacle. The speech was a very typical conversation that he has with America. We look at his, you know, many people, political scientists, look at his speeches and think that it's kind of some rambling kind of, off-scripted remarks. It's not. He's having a conversation with America. That's what you have to understand. The speech is not for us. He's speaking direct in the way that you would if you were engaging directly on these issues. That said, it received a mixed response. There was some heckling that I saw. And over the previous days, the White House outriders were rolling the pitch ahead of his arrival, and they were characteristically blunt. If you haven't read it, you should read the FT last week, an op-ed by Howard Lutnick, in which he laid out Trump's agenda, I think, in a clearer way than I've ever seen before. No one can be in any doubt. Trump was there to promote an America-first economic model, domestic industry and national sovereignty. His dislike for Europe was clear, as it's always been, and that tone then spilled out into the rooms as well. There was a high-level dinner before Trump arrived, and Lutnick had delivered a pretty dismissive intervention on Europe. Christine Lagarde stood up and walked out, and the dinner ended early. Now, amongst the CEOs there, the focus narrowed. Less talk of shaping the system. This is all the language I've heard in Davos over the last 20 years. More about managing risk and trying to work out what all these changes mean over time. For some, I would say the penny hasn't dropped yet, that President Trump actually represents a permanent change in US rest of the world relations. And that regardless, in many respects, you know, in Europe, we've got to adapt to that. So should we be afraid of the US and Trump? As it was put to me by a close watcher of the president, he reflects a deeper structural assessment in the US that allies are nice to have, but a lower price to be paid by American taxpayers. And talking to Sir Nick this morning, I know he would agree with that assessment. Now, under the grinding plates are actually quieter fractures as well. On artificial intelligence, AI, Davos wasn't really having a debate. It was running two parallel conversations that never met. Tech leaders talked about abundance, they talked about robotics, exponential gains, a kind of near utopian confidence that capability would sort out consequence. Space emerged as the next big theatre, falling launch costs, talk that within 3 years compute and LLM training would move into orbit. Better cooling, limitless scale. Elon Musk leaned in fully into the utopian vision, humanoid robots, abundance, a world of plenty. But down the corridor, policymakers and labour voices talked about jobs being hollowed out, institutions falling behind, governance nowhere near ready, not opposite ends of the spectrum, just different realities. And then Ukraine. Zelensky's challenge to Europe was stark and it was on the nose. Stop waiting for America, stop improvising, start acting like a strategic power. Yet despite being the biggest live geopolitical risk on the continent, Ukraine kept being crowded out. It was lost in the noise of the Greenland theatrics, all this border peace stuff and Davos's appetite for spectacle. The war was present, but it wasn't central. And for me, that was one of the most revealing things. What was not really discussed was the defining question of the age, the defining issue of the age. And you see where our Prime Minister is this week, and that issue is, of course, China. How China and America can manage down risk of conflict, and how Europe manages being stuck in the middle, and whether it's possible to have your cake and eat it. Questions deferred, but nevertheless critical. So what does this all mean for trust? What does it all mean for the research we do and for the way that you advise and engage in the businesses that you work for? Well, firstly, don't confuse calm markets with a stable world. Managing risk is one of the most important focus areas for boards and business leaders today. And scenario plan. Think, as my friend Nick Gowan at the BBC would say, the unthinkable. But also remember you have agency. Our trust data shows that there is a really strong bond between the employer and the employee. And the expectation that our people have in our leaders is really present. So don't hide away from that. Passivity isn't an option. And I think the trust brokering idea, Julian, that Richard and others have set forward is quite an interesting one and something maybe we should explore more. But to sort of boil it down, there is structural change happening in the world. Don't put your head in the sand. Thanks very much. Julian, back to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. So now I would like to invite Sir Nick and Selena up to the stage for their conversation. I should say, I'm sorry, we'll have time at the end for Q&A. I think mics will magically appear, so at that point, put your hands up and I'll do a bit of comparing from here. But for now, please, over to you, Selena.
Excellent. So it's a real privilege to be here to Ed's 15 years of the Trust Barometer. This is my first year within Edelman. I've actually spent almost 26 years in the comms industry. And actually the year I joined was interestingly 2003 when it said that earned media would overtake or was more important than advertising. And actually I think we're still having that debate. And I still believe actually with the LLMs that earned media is even more important today. I've spent most of the time outside of this business telling my teams not to put the Edelman Trust Barometer as the first slide in their pitch decks. But now I'm on the inside, so it's a real privilege to be part of that and the depth and breadth of what you'll see in those many slides. But even more of a privilege today to be having a conversation with Sir Nick Clegg, someone that, as Julian said, has spent time actually as a journalist, then, as we all know, in politics, and then in business. And written a book or two, which we'll touch on. I'm going to attempt for a whistle-stop tour of many, many subjects that Nick can speak brilliantly on. So we'll start with the Trust Barometer. We'll move into the book. We'll move to the world, and we'll come back to the UK and maybe Davos in between. But please do think of questions whilst we're talking, because there'll be plenty of time for that for the audience. So first off, to the touching on the Trust Barometer. insularity, which seems to be a word that I'd never heard of about a month ago, and now it's every hour in this business. So insularity, there was actually, you a Traitors fan?
No.
No.
But sorry, I haven't watched it, so
No.
I could be
I'm
a
sure
fan.
there are many Traitors fans in the audience, and actually there was a column in the Times that actually said we are nation of traitors, and actually we are wary. It's essentially a low trust environment and a nation of insularity. So your perspective, do you think this is new? And also, do you think that actually a lot of the responsibility is driven towards the changing communications landscape for that?
Gosh, well, I'm not my instinct is it's not new, it's human nature. I think confidence in other people, your trust in other people, in other institutions, it seems to me, I mean, I'm sure one can measure this somehow, but my intuitive gut reaction is it's heavily correlated to whether you're feeling secure about your own circumstances and that of your family. If you're feeling insecure about crime on the street, or whether your kids are going to get a job, or whether there's going to be a war tomorrow, is this working? No. I don't know whether I need to move. And so, you know, we live in a very insecure world. You could argue that, you know, globalization itself has infused into developed societies in particular, you know, very pronounced process of sort of socioeconomic insecurity. Labor markets are not stable. Lifetime jobs are a thing of the past. And we've also, as I think your report says, I mean, people respond to events which elicit fear and insecurity. And, you know, we've just had, you can't stop events, but we have been, particularly perhaps in this country, we've just been battered by one event after the next, which make people feel as if the ground on which they're standing and which they're trying to raise their families and so on, it just constantly keeps shifting. And I just find it totally logical that in those circumstances you retreat to the people you love and you care about most. So I find it neither surprising nor new. And I think, if you think, you know, and I think it's the big events that matter. I think we get so drawn into, is it because of, so to answer your question, I'm sure, of course, the changing media landscape plays a role, but I tend to think those are more symptoms rather than causes. I think, as I say, I think the roiling effect of globalization itself is a very important thing over the last, 26 years that this barometer has been going. I think the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, created an eruption in optimism and security, and then, of course, has given way to new divisions. I think in this country, perhaps most especially, I think the great financial crash in 2008, I think it's almost impossible to overstate how important that is to the life of this country. It meant that millions of people first thought, oh, crikey, the people in positions of authority, regulators, governments, bankers, are charlatans or didn't know what they're doing. And secondly, of course, the damage it did to real take-home pay. And when I was in politics, I always used to be obsessed about this. I think it's just kind of obvious. If your earnings go up less than the prices of the things you have to buy in the shops, you constantly feel you're running to stand still. And that happened to millions of Britons through no fault of their own because of the financial crash for a decade and a half. I mean, tragically, earnings just started exceeding prices, the increase in prices just ahead of the Brexit referendum. And then the Brexit referendum sort of flipped that into reverse again. And then, of course, we had Brexit. We're almost unique in the developed world, just to focus on the UK for the moment. I know the barometer is a global thing, but we're almost unique in the UK to have two events which are sort of economically sort of seismic. I mean, but the financial crash hit us much harder than others because of the oversized role of the financial services sector compared to the size of the economy. The city was much bigger as a proportion to the size of the economy than Wall Street is to the US, for instance. And so what? They now calculated that cost us 6-7% of GDP. That is an enormous number. And the latest estimates, if you look at the report from the National Bureau of Economic Research just a month ago, is that Brexit matched, if not exceeded, that hit to GDP, which is, again, unique to us. There's no developed economy in the world which in less than a decade suffered two near existential economic shocks like that. And so anyway, the long and the short of it, if that keeps happening, and then of course we had the pandemic, and then we had all the batshit crazy stuff of those governments and Johnson and Truss and all that kind of crazy stuff, then of course you go like, screw this, I'm going to try and look after myself and the people. I mean, I feel it, don't you? You all feel it? You just kind of, you look at the news, you go, this is just like crap, I just don't know what's happening next. And you just, of course you retreat. So I find it neither surprising nor new, and I think in our country, of course in others as well, it is a logical response to the swirling events around us.
So more depressing account.
No,
but true and
well,
factual.
no, I suppose for the purposes of your question, I am, to put it very glibly, and I do this deliberately, I'm extremely skeptical, to put it mildly, of the idea there's some tech or algorithmic fix to this. And I just think, yes, social media plays a role, but if you look at the research, you actually look at the research of the causal link between, whether it's using social media or just being online and polarization, there is just no, I mean, in fact, I think it's Professor Genskow in Stanford who's done probably the most accomplished longitudinal study on this, what they call affective polarization amongst the academics, actually has gone up amongst parts of the population that use the internet the least. Though countries where internet use has gone up, polarization in some cases has gone down. In America, polarization erupted before social media even became a thing. So yeah, of course, I mean, look, I don't want to sound as if I just drank the Kool-Aid in Silicon Valley. I just think we shouldn't turn ourselves into techno-determinists. I know why it's tempting, emotionally, intellectually, because it'd be so nice to think that all you need to do is yell at the tech bros and they tweak a knob and we're all happy. It's like, it's not like that. And I just I think sometimes that, and of course you've got vested interests at play, you've got the established press, particularly the newspapers in this country and elsewhere, who hate social media because they screwed up their advertising model, so they've got an axe to grind, so they keep saying, oh, it's just because of the algorithms. I just don't think any dispassionate view of what we've been through as a society can I mean, I wish it were otherwise. If it was a tech fix, it'd be great. We could do it tomorrow.
So lots of this is covered in Nick's book, which as a good interviewer, I have
Flying
read.
off the shelves
Flying
like
off the
hotcakes
shelves.
in all good bookshops.
So in your book, you talk about the digital paradox, which essentially is actually what has happened is we've got much, much more power to the individuals, much more democratization. And I think you refer to fishermen in Rwanda on the lakes can actually communicate with people completely the other side of the world. But actually, on the flip side, there is much, much more centralization of power. So talk about that a bit more. And do you think this will continue? Or will we restore the balance of that paradox?
Yeah, so I call it the power paradox, as you describe. These technologies, most people in this room use all sorts of software on your phones and so on. They're very empowering to all of us, aren't they, in our everyday lives? A lot of these apps and services are highly personalized to our needs, our likes, our wishes, and so on. But it's a sort of it's an odd compact because that comes, if you like, on the back of a highly centralized power, a locus of power in Silicon Valley and increasingly in China, because these technologies are provided to us on these very centralized platforms, which are in turn driven by network effects, which mean they become very large, et cetera. I think that is accelerating now on steroids because of the fundamental physics of large language models. Large language models are an exception. It's in fact an exceptionally inefficient technology. You're having to literally boil the ocean. I mean, you guys ask, I don't know, how do I get from here to Victoria Station? And another person asks, invent a new chemical compound. The amount of water and energy that is consumed by most LLMs to answer both is about the same. Because you're literally these systems are literally just scouring all the data they've ingested when these models have been trained. And then, of course, you have these billions of parameters that link all the data. All the data is tokenized. And then because these are generative, probabilistic machines, they then guess probabilistically what the next token response should be. And, of course, we've done a very odd thing in the societal debate. We've turned something which we call artificial intelligence, and we spend our time constantly anthropomorphizing it. They're machines. They're not humans. They have no human intelligence at all. In fact, they're still quite stupid machines. They have no concept of the world at all. But the point to your question is, it's based on very, very centralizing technology, because it is exceptionally expensive to get hold of the compute capacity, the GPUs, build the data centers, get the energy and the water, to boil the ocean, metaphorically speaking, every time any of us ask them a question or a prompt. So as long as that fundamental physics remains the case, it's why we don't have any foundation model developers of any consequence in this country, because we can't afford it. I remember speaking to Jeremy Hunt when he was a chancellor, and I was at Silicon Valley, and I was telling him that I think that year, a few years ago now, sorry, is this working? A few years ago now, that the amount of money that Meta was going to spend on, can you hear me? It's not sure. Anyway, oh, there you go. I'm going to come and go. Like
Here,
politics.
do it, hand up.
Shall I use this? Yeah. Okay, there we go. I remember saying to Jeremy, when I was speaking to him when I was at Meta, that year I think Meta was going to spend 70 billion, I think it was, a year. 70 billion a year just on the infrastructure to train, not even to run, which is called the inference of these models, not even to run the inference of these models. And we sort of laughed rather awkwardly, that a G7 economy like the UK couldn't afford to do what one, and not even one of the leading AI US companies is doing. That's the scale of it. And I think Zuckerberg announced yesterday they've pretty well doubled that for next year. They're now expecting to spend 130 billion a year, every year. And Google is spending more, Microsoft is spending more, Amazon is spending more. So that's why this power paradox, that this stuff, and every time you guys use ChatGPT and use Gemini and so on, you feel you've got the great personalized service, it's very empowering to us, but it's on the back of a technology, because of the physics that I've described, that is very centralizing. That will continue as long as the large language model paradigm is the paramount paradigm. And I'm not personally on the sort of range of being relatively sanguine about AI and being a little bit more skeptical about the capacity of LLMs, through to people who breathlessly say it's going to replace humanity tomorrow and everything's going to be changed and so on. I'm very much at the former end. I think there's a ludicrous amount of hype. I think these LLMs are almost by design flawed, because it's generative technology, it's probabilistic technology, so you're never going to get, well, you can customize them for your own purposes, but you're never going to get the absolute precision that you might expect from these technologies. They're always going to hallucinate. The people in the companies don't quite know why these machines do what they do. That's how, they don't know how this boiling the ocean thing really works. They don't quite know why it spits out the token that it does. So there is a glimmer, I think, and I won't bore you with it, but I'm very involved in one undertaking which hopefully will take root here in Europe to pursue a completely different AI paradigm. It's loosely called the world model paradigm, where you don't use LLM architecture, you use, you train these models on sort of sensory and visual data to kind of intuit the world from a fragmentary exposure to it, if I can put it like that. A bit like toddlers, human beings as toddlers. We have this remarkable ability to look at one little bit of the canvas and sort of understand what the rest of it is. And I think if those models were to flourish, that would have a hugely disruptive and possibly positively disruptive effect, because they're much cheaper to run. And if you open source them, we can all use them for free without having to have this API link back to the servers in Guangzhou or Silicon Valley. So I think look out, for those of you following this, look out for those paradigm-shifting developments in AI. I think there is a possibility that this very clunky, centralized, boil the ocean approach may not be the one actually in the long run which persists.
So moving from digital power to in real life power in Davos last week, and I know many people in this room were in Davos and many were following it. Ed's obviously just given a great account. Trump's presence, Carney's speech, didn't mention David Beckham's interview in the wake of the cracks to Brown Beckham, which happened last week too. We spoke about some of the Carney speech and actually the middle power. What do you think the key conversations in Davos were last week that you found really interesting?
Well, I wasn't there, so I have no idea.
But
no. I mean, it's actually the first time I haven't been in 15 years, and from listening to Ed's account, it's a great shame I wasn't there. It obviously sounded like quite a bun fight. Firstly, as I think Ed said, I've long been of the view that from America's own perspective and for a whole bunch of political and cultural forces in America which have been brewing for ages, which are crystallized dramatically in the form of Trump, the Trump 2 administration, but actually kind of go deeper and wider than him. I think you just have to plan for a world in which the sort of transatlantic bond that we've all grown up with in the post-war period, and particularly the Cold War period, is gone. And I do worry tremendously, which is why Mark Carney's speech was so helpful, because it was put in sort of very much, he's very much Davos man. It was put in that very sort of moderate, thoughtful, slightly sort of technocratic way, but I think it was one that really communicates with an elite, particularly in this country, who I wonder whether they've really still got it. I sort of feel the British and media elite are much slower than elites across the rest of Europe. I was saying to you beforehand that the British and media elite, for understandable reasons, because we sort of cling on to Uncle Sam's coattails so much more clamorly than anyone else for a whole bunch of historical reasons and cultural reasons, linguistic reasons, and so on. But also after Brexit, of course, that was the whole promise of the Brexiteers. No, we've got this great relationship with Uncle Sam that will look after us. Well, that didn't go very well, did it? And I just think so. Everybody's left a bit bereft, and the British political and media elite, in sort of very crude terms, sort of remind me of those kind of cartoon characters that run off the edge of a cliff and just keep running furiously, and the ground has fallen out from under them. And I just worry we're not being nearly fast enough as a country, because this is going to take a decade plus to recalibrate our place in the world, to reduce the dependencies that we have to reduce for sovereign reasons, to reposition ourselves in our own hemisphere in Europe. So, and I always sometimes hear people sort of, you see these portentous columnists saying, no, it's absolute nonsense to say that the Europe should try and stand on its own 2 feet. You can't do it, you have to do it, and it's going to take a long time. So if it's going to take a long time, start now, get moving. And I just don't feel there's an urgency to now get moving on what will be a decade-long plus project. So I think it was great that Mark put it so clearly and succinctly. I think this idea of middle powers is a very good one. I think the problem we have, of course, as a continent of middle powers, once great powers, obviously powers with colonial, global reach and all the rest of it, is we know in Europe what we need. As I'm sort of pretending blissfully for a minute that Brexit didn't happen. So let's just talk Europe writ large, including us and Norway and Turkey and so on. We know roughly what we have to do. We have to deepen European scale and market integration. We have to create deep liquid capital markets, so you've got more risk taking. You have to create sort of culture. You clearly have to change what are unsustainable welfare systems. Europe represents roughly 5% of the world's population and 50% of the world's welfare expenditure. That just doesn't work. We have a shrinking working population trying to generate income, which is actually why I think AI is a good thing, because it actually helps. The Japanese understand this, by the way. Speak to any Japanese decision makers. They understand that AI is a great gift to help them make their very heavy expenditure on the elderly more sustainable. Our problem is we don't have what I'd call European patriotism. And we all know that we have to try and be the sum of our parts. Size matters, scale matters, particularly, of course, as you've got China and the US measuring up against each other, and India most especially, but also Brazil and Indonesia and other rising powers, but India most especially will very much shape the world of our kids and our grandkids. And scale and size matters, and you can't politically build size and scale unless, I thought one of the most interesting things recently, I wish I knew his name, one of you might know it, there was a snippet somewhere in the papers today or yesterday that a German footballer said something like, Trump is making us all not just German, but European. I've got to look at who it was. But anyway, I thought it was so interesting. I thought, that's a sport, I think a popular sportsman in Germany saying something really quite important, because if he's right, and it does make us all more European and not more German, French, Italian, British, then maybe then that will create political energy which will compel the politicians to develop the scale which they currently don't. Most sort of Carney-esque type politicians get that you have to become the sum of your parts in this cluttered, messy, old, wonderful continent of ours. We just don't have the political fuel to do it because people don't identify. So who knows? Maybe that'd be the greatest gift that Trump bestows on us, is a sort of new form of European patriotism?
So massive question. You touched on India there, you touched on China, massive question. Starmer's obviously in China at the moment. How do you see the powers between the US, China, India, Russia? Big question in a couple of sentences.
You're kidding. It's too big a question. I guess the only observation I would make, which might be of interest here, only because it's something I vaguely sort of follow, is I think in many respects China is already winning the AI, the sort of race to AI supremacy. If you listen to my former boss, Mark Zuckerberg, and others, they'll say privately and publicly, the reason you've got this great love-in between Trump and all the tech bros is not just because of sort of, you know, naked commercial calculation and so on, and transactionalism and all loathing of Democrats or whatever they say, but the way they both explain and or dignify all of this coming together is they say, no, we have to, you know, DC and Silicon Valley have to now work in lockstep with each other to beat the Chinese. And I think it's a sort of prediction I make with some conviction that American attempt to beat the Chinese will fail on its own terms. And you can see it in some signs already. The energy strategy that the Chinese have on AI is already more coherent than the Americans. Of course, they've got less compunction to deploy AI much more quickly because they don't have privacy and data protection rules in the same way. They run the world's largest surveillance state so that they can roll out these tools very quickly. They're churning out AI data scientists in huge numbers, more than anywhere else in the country, from universities in Chinese cities the size of European, you know, countries, cities you've never heard the name of before, and really interestingly, they're leading on something I'm very a huge advocate of sort of open source AI models, where you allow people to use these models without having to pay to use them on a sort of API basis. So if you go to Latin America, you go to Southeast Asia, you go to Africa and so on, you will see Qwen, DeepSeek, Kimi and others, all these models being used on a much greater scale than the US. So I think that is a very, very important thing to keep a track of. You've got this bizarre role reversal. The world's largest autocracy, for one reason or another, is doing more to democratize free access to this new technology around the world, and the world's largest democracy is doing more to sort of propagate closed proprietary AI systems. So who wins out on that? And I put my money on the Chinese at the moment. Will have a huge impact on your wider question about, you know, the sort of planetary alignment. And of course, as I think you both said, you know, Europe's slightly stuck in the middle. And of course, I'll just finish on this. Our task, it seems to me, is not just to be a victim to sort of the predatory intentions of these big and rising powers. We have to develop our own agency. Otherwise, we really just become the recipients of history rather than in any meaningful way the co-authors of it. And that's not something I want for my kids or grandkids or for a wonderful country or a wonderful continent like Europe.
And talking about that agency and bringing it closer to home, I mean, many people in this room have very global roles and a global outlook, but many of us are proud to be Londoners and work in London. And we had a conversation earlier this week about actually where are the green shoots in London and the UK, because it can be very gloomy. As an agency at Edelman, we're very proud to have just started being the comms partner for South by Southwest London for their second year in London. And I think that's a vote of confidence for this city and this country around culture, creativity and technology. We talked about the startup scene. So where do you think the green shoots, to end on a positive before I open it up to the floor, where do you think the green shoots are for London and what do we need to do?
Oh, I mean, I think there are lots and lots of green shoots. The problem is they're shoots.
Yep.
And you need to make them into great, you know, I don't know, what's the analogy?
Forest.
Yes, great forests. I mean, when I became Deputy Prime Minister, there wasn't really, so that's 16 years ago, there wasn't really any meaningful tech startup scene in this country or this city at all. And just tooting our little trumpet, if I may, for a moment, I think the coalition actually introduced some really pioneering fiscal and legal and other changes, which, you know, Silicon Roundabout, do you remember all that kind of stuff, which really kick-started it, and of course lots of other people did lots of great things. And you've now got one of the world's most meaningful tech startup scenes in London. I mean, I mean, really of real kind of world renown. You've got a great deal of talent. The big tech companies, oddly enough, are actually using London increasingly as a place to employ high-value engineers for low cost, because now we get away with, or people receive wages here which are so much lower than in Silicon Valley. We've got fantastic universities, we've got the English language, and we've got this wonderful British culture of creativity and ingenuity and so on. Our problem is no longer that bit of this, no longer that bit of the rungs in that ladder. I think we're doing really, really well. If you're a young person with a really smart new idea in AI or software or hardware, you can very easily now raise 8, 9, 10 million pounds if you need to somewhere and get going. The problem is the moment you need to raise 30, 40, 50 million, or you want to really get market scale, you end up basically going to Sand Hill Road in Palo Alto, because that's where they can throw money at you pretty quickly, no strings attached. But then they say, well, I went to visit one of the sort of leading private quantum labs in Silicon Valley when I was last there. There's 4 British academics there,
right, yeah.
all looking a bit sunburned. And I said to them, what are you doing here? And they said, well, it's the only way we could get the cash. And when we took the cash, they said, well, you've got to move your headquarters to 20 minutes drive from our office in Sand Hill Road. So I often say to people, it's like, I would say to people, can you imagine if all of you will have phones, which will, the vast majority, maybe some of you will have Samsungs, but the vast majority will have US designed phones. Pretty much all the software on your phones will be US software. All your data will be stored on US cloud. The operating systems are US operating systems, iOS and Android. The AI agents you're dealing with are the US. And you've no doubt got friends that I just referred to who, when they do well, bugger off to America. I always say to people, just imagine if you replaced US with France in everything I've just said. I mean, the Daily Mail and Farage and Westminster would go absolutely nuts at the catastrophic loss of sovereignty, the fact that we've remitted our whole digital online identity to another country, and that we then export all our best people with the best ideas when they really start developing success to that country as well. But because it's America and it's Uncle Sam, because we like Hollywood and because of the post-war period. And I love America as much as anyone else. I've studied there. I've got 2 of my kids who both live and work there. I've worked all the rest of it. But this is just not a smart way to proceed as a country which is on this side of the Atlantic, not that one. So I would love to see, and it's one of the things I'm trying to do now in my own sort of private commercial life, I just love us to sort of be much, much more focused on celebrating this green shoot creativity, and it's wonderful that you're doing the South by Southwest thing, but just being obsessive about scale. And I'm afraid it does link together. You can't create scale here if you are divorced from your largest marketplace on your doorstep in Europe. So you do need to look at these things in the round. We can fix them. We can fix this all quite quickly if we just did it with a greater sense of ambition and mission than appears to be the case in the debate here at the moment.
Brilliant. Really practical challenge for us all. So, questions?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much. That was fascinating. So, hands are going up everywhere. I'm going to hand over to the team to pick at random.
10.
Please.
You talked about the European need to reform the welfare bill. There's reports in the media this morning that the Prime Minister has vetoed yet another attempt to reform the UK welfare bill before the next election. Just how do we get the political will in this country to seriously reform the welfare bill?
Well, gosh, I'm afraid I'm going to become... I'm not a politician. I haven't been a politician for ages. I'm an ex-politician and so on. But I really do, and I've never spent any time waffling on about what my successors do in the Lib Dems and so on and so forth. But I just think this is really a question for the left and the centre left in this country. And part of the reason why the Labour Party is so stuck is when people like me, at a time when we had to pick up the pieces of an absolute disaster in 2008, where you clearly had any government would have had to make difficult savings, including welfare savings, pension savings, and so on. Including, by the way, if the Labour government had got into power in 2010, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, not that Gordon Brown ever wants to be reminded of this, actually legislated in the spring of 2010 to reduce the deficit more quickly than the coalition subsequently did in the 5 years. So But what the left did after 2010 is, rather than accept that the country was just having to take some very difficult decisions, they did what the left, I'm afraid, always does, is they replace policy with sanctimony. And they just elevated sanctimony to a sort of political operating system and just berated anyone and everyone who said, like, there's a mismatch here. We've got an aging population. We have a social and healthcare system which is simply not sustainable in the way it's currently configured. We've just had a near-death experience in 2008. We have the largest peacetime, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think it's very difficult for Starmer now to lead his party, because Labour leaders have basically been lying to themselves for about a decade and a half about the predicament the country's in. So I just think it's very difficult for I think other centre-left parties in other parts of Europe have been better, particularly in Scandinavia and elsewhere. I mean, they've got much more developed welfare systems based on more consensus. But at the end of the day, I just think it does come down to politics and political leadership. Everyone knows the situation we're in cannot it can carry on, but we'll become a more and more embittered political community because we'll basically be condemning ourselves to fight increasingly aggressively about who gets what from a shrinking pie. And that is a terrible, terrible destination. And I worry as a man from of the centre left, if I can put it like that the centre left in Britain, across much of Europe, certainly in North America, you hear the Democrats, they're just intellectually so paralysed and barren at the moment. All the energy, a lot of it's batshit energy, but a lot of the energy is from the right, and from nationalism, chauvinism, and the politics of belonging and identity and insularity and so on. So I don't think this is going to be solved by having endless little spats with your backbenchers and marching troops through the lobby and then back again. And so these are all little kind of skirmishes in a bigger thing, which is that the centre-left is sort of curiously, sort of intellectually out of step with the needs of the time. And in the end, voters will intuit that and they'll vote you out.
Lady in the middle there, Jenny.
Thank you. I might stand up so I'm not a disembodied voice. Thank you. That was all really fascinating. Because this is the largest room of communicators I've been in for quite a while, I wanted to raise this point. There was a really interesting article in The Economist about 2 weeks ago saying that the main problem with the economy is pessimism. Because we're all here and able to diagnose risk, but also we're in the art of persuasion, I wondered what we can do collectively to help change the overall narrative.
Well, as a communicator, I think... Sorry, this sounds a bit... I'm going to stand up now so I can see you, otherwise I'll be a disembodied voice to you. This is just maybe a trite observation. I think tone matters. I really do think... I mean, tone matters in all communication, but tone matters. And I think just because other people have chosen to scream at each other and have decided that screaming is a good way of communicating doesn't mean folk in your profession and people who want to generally pursue a more optimistic and small p progressive approach to life shouldn't, religiously stick to a tone which is respectful, which is thoughtful, which accepts someone else's point of view, that, in that sort of Bertrand Russell tradition, accepts you can always be wrong, that is open to doubt. I stubbornly think that we shouldn't patronise voters, we shouldn't patronise people. Generally, we shouldn't patronise the public. They get that, but so that's the first thing. The second thing is we've got a lot, as I hope I haven't been too gloomy. I mean, we've got a lot to be very optimistic about. I just worry that we're still just lying to ourselves. We're lying to ourselves about where we've come from, a little bit about the 2008, 2016 stuff. We're lying to ourselves about some of the issues we've got about the regulatory and welfare state in this country. We're lying to ourselves about how adrift we are as a country, no longer able to rely on Uncle Sam, cut off from our own European continent. So I think maybe the first thing to do, which you can do calmly, you can do methodically, you can do optimistically, is just to strip away some of this kind of weird doublespeak. It's as if we don't admit to ourselves, because you can solve problems once you are plain about what the problems are. And I sort of feel for a long time we're in this weird Alice in Wonderland world where we just don't say, here are the problems. Here are the... I'll give you another one. This is just an anecdote, but I hope illustrates the point, and I hope is of some interest. Over the last maybe 6-8 months, I've had two people who used to work for me when I was Deputy Prime Minister, who were junior civil servants at the time, who subsequently became very senior civil servants, one of them very senior civil servants, who came to me and just privately and said, could I give them any advice about how to maybe leave Whitehall and go into the private sector? I'm sure many of you have been in government, have gone to the private sector, you've been on that journey yourselves. And I said to both of them, but what on earth are you doing? You know, you're the kind of people that this country needs, you're the kind of people who the ship of state, you could both aspire to become cabinet secretary. And separately, but in parallel conversations, they both used exactly the same chilling phrase to me. They said, no, it's changed, Nick, you can't get anything done. And when senior civil servants, and then I asked them, I said, well, what, is it different to what it was 15 years ago? And for a whole bunch of other reasons I won't go into here, they really do think it is. It's just become totally gummed up. The regulatory state in this country is in very, very bad shape and is just gumming stuff up. When you've got and these are two really decent, smart, kind, thoughtful, public-spirited individuals who I know them both well enough to know that they would be just driven to exasperation before having that conversation with me. Both say, you just can't do anything anymore. Then, like, why don't we surface that more? Why from right and left and centre, everyone should think it's a bad thing that the regulatory state in this country appears to be making it impossible just to do anything. And I think once you spell it out, once you get people on board, solutions become people then become creative, and then people become motivated. And it's as if we don't get to first base on a lot of these problems at the moment. Lecture over.
Gentleman in the middle there.
Hi, Sir Clegg. Alan Jaglenzer from University of Cambridge. You mentioned a Stanford study about the impact of social media on some of the dark stuff that we saw in this deck. I'm curious, can you clarify whether you actually believe that? Because I've read virtually every study there is in this space, and I'm curious, what do you think is the impact of social media and media on what we've seen in the Trust Index?
So yeah, it's worth having a look at. I think his name's Matthew Gentzkow. It might be a bit out of date now, but most studies on what they call affective polarization, so that they measure different forms of polarization. But so the affective polarization is what you think about someone who thinks differently to you. Almost no study has shown a sort of causal link between what apps you use and whether you have increased or lower levels of affective polarization. I think there are a whole bunch of things, good and bad, about social media. I just don't buy the narrative that division in politics has been created by what's on people's feeds. It sometimes might exacerbate it in some cases. There's actually quite a lot of evidence. The Berkman Klein Institute, which you'll know in Harvard, did a very good survey of this. That if you listen in the U.S. context, if you listen to cable news and just consumed sort of Trump on Twitter, you had a much narrower digest of information about the news than if you were scrolling on Facebook. And for the reason for that is almost a technical one. The way, it's changing enormously now because social media is becoming much more of a sort of pipeline for recommended short-form video. But back then, the main signals that the ranking algorithms would use to decide what you saw at the top of your Facebook feed would be what groups you're members of, what content you've engaged with. But by far the biggest signal was simply who you're friends with on Facebook. And as you know, friends on Facebook aren't really actually friends. They're the ex-girlfriend you had 20 years ago. It's that annoying colleague who's pestered you constantly on the desk next to you. It's the dad from your daughter's football group and so on. So it's what sociologists call weak. It's your mad uncle. It's weak sociological links. And again, this is not me saying it. It's just very evidence based. Since that is the biggest signal that the ranking algorithm would use to decide what content you would see, so you'd see a post from your mad uncle who believes that the Earth is flat before you'd see an ad for shoe wear from Melbourne, Australia, because you're nowhere near there. When it comes to news and politics, actually the digest of what you get is much more mixed than if you read the Daily Mail every day, or you nothing else, or if you watch cable news. So I think that if you think about how these things are architected, it actually makes sense that it's difficult to find a causal link between one and the other. Doesn't mean there aren't other very big forces which are very, very powerful and clearly have an effect. I think, personally, the fact of virality is been more important than this assertion of sort of siloed, rabbit holes for which there just isn't as much evidence. I mean, virality is clearly very, very new. We've never inhabited a world where you, at a swipe of a screen or a push of a button, millions of people can suddenly see your private thoughts. And that, of course, in a world where, what was famously said, that, a lie makes its way halfway around the world before the truth has even got its boots on, and where there is evidence that content that is alarming, that is emotionally potent, that is angry, by the way, for the same reason that tabloid newspapers stick headlines which elicit anger, fear, jealousy, because it sells, because it provokes in us. So yeah, I think that is a dynamic which I think definitely has an effect, more so than this idea that people have been, that these algorithms have created this sort of, had a sort of sorting effect and putting us into different groups. I don't think there's much evidence for that. Sure. I don't work at Silicon Valley anymore. I don't work on this stuff. So if you just advance warning, I wouldn't want to spend too much time on it now.
I think we've probably just got time for one or two more. That's the lady at the front here.
Thank you. Sarah Waddington, I'm the CEO of the Public Relations and Communications Association. Just bought your book. Just wanted to say it's been a fantastic...
Did you all hear that?
Yeah.
Just not sure if you said it loud enough.
Don't judge me. Just wanted to say, fantastic event this morning, really insightful. This retreat into insularity is incredibly resonant, hugely concerning. But the glimmer for me, where I stay optimistic, is that there is a massive opportunity for anybody in public relations. Our role is to foster communications and broker understanding between disparate groups, and it's never been needed more. And I will say that, and I'll die on that hill. My question is a selfish one, really, for me and my members, which I'm proud to say is Edelman. How do we get UK government to pay more attention to the work that we do and invest in our services more? How can we get them to lean in us? Because we can fix many of the wicked problems that we're talking about here today, and which Edelman has surfaced within their latest report.
I honestly can't help you with that. I mean, I suspect the answer is mainly relationships, I would have thought. And I'm sure many of you got very good relationships with folk in government. To talk to them, help them. I mean, the main thing they need is help. So don't come and berate them, and don't come and sort of wring your hands and say, isn't it all terrible? They need, I mean, I experienced this myself. I cannot exaggerate. If you're in government, particularly if you're very senior in government, you can barely think. I cannot exaggerate it's a constant bombardment. It's overwhelming. You're underslept. You're overwhelmed by information. You've got incoming. You've got parties to lead. You'll be yelled at in the House of Commons. You've got the press on you, attacking you. You've got international events. These folk just have very, very little time to just calmly think. They're in sort of, you've got to almost treat them as if they're in a sort of almost permanent fight or flight sort of state of mind. So come to them calmly with solutions which are practical. I think what is not helpful in government is when, this is a facetious thing, but you just illustrate the point. I remember occasionally when I was, and of course my political fortunes went up briefly and then just on a long-term decline straight afterwards. But I remember people used to come up to me and say, do you know what you should do? You should get the BBC to run like more positive stories about what you're doing. No shit, Sherlock. You're kidding. It's like sometimes people treat people in government like absolute idiots or children. They're not. These are generally, and I have to speak up for the political class, the vast majority of people in politics actually do scratch under the dreadful surface perhaps, go into politics and public service for good reasons, because they do believe in something. They do believe the country could be better tomorrow than it is today. So just come to them calmly with things that help them, and imagine yourself in that peculiar situation. I think what doesn't work in government is either giving just useless advice like that, or bemoaning the situation, or asking them to do something which is so wildly unrealistic that it's just ain't going to happen. So, but if you do that, I suspect government will be very responsive to you.
Thank you.
Just a small reflection on that, and merging Sarah's question and Jenny's question. I think there's a real role for business to be able to communicate and act in areas that government cares about. So just to give a small example, we've just worked on a really successful campaign for Lego education. Government are grappling with how AI can be embraced in the classroom, and how kids can embrace it in a safe and positive way. Lego want to help that in the classroom. That's a win-win for government and business, and it's really positive for the Lego brand as well. So I think there's an opportunity for actually not just to tell government that we need more communications and we're brilliant, but to help them with what they need to do as well.
Help solve it. Okay, last question. Gentleman up here on the right.
Thanks very much. Guy from Heineken. As the report shows us moving towards insularity, as you talk about there's no magic button to make us all happy, as we move to a social media ban for under 16-year-olds, is it time to move back to more traditional ways of creating social cohesion, bringing people together? I'd obviously shout for the place of the pub for bringing people together. Is there a move back towards traditional ways of us talking to each other, expressing our feelings face to face so we know what each other means instead of a tweet or a comment on?
I'm a little less pessimistic. I mean, I don't know about you, but certainly the communities I know, I think sort of face-to-face, community-based convenings and coming together, whether it's in pubs, whether it's on the side of a football pitch, or whether it's in the yoga class, or whether it's in your local park, or whether it's in a youth centre or whatever. I think that's, and of course social media often is a very powerful catalyst exactly for that. How do all these groups mobilise? How do the football fan groups? How do the parent groups? How do the youth clubs? They all work. They've all got their WhatsApp groups. They've all got their Facebook pages. So I don't see it as an either or. I think clearly if you spend all your life on screen, but by the way, the only thing I would say to sort of maybe offset the pessimism, we've kind of had some of these panics before. I mean, I'm 59. I remember the time many of you, well, I'm trying to assess age here, but many of you might remember in the 70s and 80s, this kind of extraordinary assumption that if little Jimmy spent 5 minutes playing games, video games, they'd turn into an axe murderer. I mean, literally, it was a total societal hysteria that a slight bit of exposure to video games was going to turn you into a pathological murderer. My mum, I remember, I've got two brothers and a sister, I remember when ads started turning up on terrestrial television in the early mid-70s. My mum would, and it's even more extreme. I remember firstly, she wouldn't allow us watch telly for more than 20 minutes because there was this whole thing about this telly was, and very similar language was used. It was going to burrow into our neural pathways and turn us from sort of innocent, lovely, outward-bound kids into kind of vegetables. But I remember there was actually particularly one kid in my class whose parents would send him out of the room when ads would turn up for, I don't know, washing up powder or something, or I don't know, bacon and cheese pancakes or whatever, because that, ads was going to do. We do, and if you look at the history of technology, from the bicycle to the radio to the internet itself, we tend as a species to freak out, and there are plenty of good reasons to be very mindful of the bad uses of technology and the dark side of technology and so on. But I think it's also mindful to remember that we tend to kind of overdo we tend to overdo how much we think it's technology that's doing stuff to us, when in fact we have much more agency. And unfortunately, the evidence, in as much as this matters, I mean, for what it's worth, on the 16-year-old ban, I probably would do something different as a matter of public policy. But hey, if that's what we decide as a society, go ahead and do it. The evidence, of course, is always going to be quite debatable. You may have seen there's quite a lot of press recently about that actually very long and impressive and rigorous study done by the academics from the University of Manchester, where they struggled to find any link between the length of time on screen. They didn't measure other things. It was just screen time and subjective and other measured forms of well-being amongst adolescents and teenagers. So I'm not as... there you go. I'm wildly optimistic. Then, end. Right.
Listen, I promised you a sunny upward note at the end. There you go. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Nick. Thank you.